We can start by asking you, what do TLA do? What does Turning Lives Around do?
Sure. Well, thanks for having me on the show.
My pleasure.
It's good to be here. So Turning Lives Around is quite a big charity working in Leeds and Wakefield. It's actually been going 50 years, which really surprised me. I've just joined them in September, so I'm quite new. And we work with homeless people. So we're housing and supporting people, including adults, couples, families, and also children. And we do a lot of our services in partnership with other organisations like Gipsil and Foundation, Touchstone, so other big charities that people might have heard about in the city. A lot of our work is commissioned by Leeds City Council. We're working with 1,000 people every year who are homeless, who are coming through our services. And yeah, we've got quite a number of different ways that we work with people. People straight off the streets, rough sleeping, into what used to be called hostels that we manage, and then helping people move out into dispersed accommodation out in the community with our support, and then ultimately onto their own tenancies. That's the hope, anyway.
Right. Wow. So you deal with approximately 1,000 people, you say, each and every year. That kind of brings us to my next question, really. But how many homeless people are there in Leeds, Yorkshire, the UK? I mean, do we have a higher rate of homelessness in Leeds and Yorkshire, or is it less? What kind of numbers are we talking about?
So yeah, I have got some numbers for you, and homelessness in general has been rising over the last 10-15 years. The increase has slowed a little bit more recently, which is a good thing. So in terms of rough sleeping, there are over 4,000 people every night sleeping rough in England, and there's been a 21% increase in the numbers outside of London, and most of the numbers are in London and the south. I think that's possibly partly to do with the weather. It's
warmer,
not
right?
Quite as painful to sleep out down there. But obviously London's a massive city, and there's a lot of social issues there.
I've got to say, the last time I was in London, just walking through Oxford Street, which is actually where I used to work when I first came out of school, the number of homeless people was. They were just lining the streets. Really, there were tents lining parts of the streets. So,
that's right.
4,000, even though it is obviously a large number, seems quite. It doesn't seem as bad as I would imagine.
Yeah, well, that's rough sleeping, and there are over 100,000 people who are accepted by councils around the country as being homeless.
Right.
But they don't all sleep rough, clearly.
So they get shelter, is what you're saying? Right?
Yeah, that's right. They get housed mostly by the local authorities. And so that's 100,000 every year that are accepted as homeless. But right now there are 271,000 people who are homeless, and that includes 123,000 children.
Wow.
Yeah, so they're all in hostels, B&Bs, temporary accommodation, mostly, with just that tiny minority of 4,000 sleeping rough. And thankfully in West Yorkshire, our numbers are nowhere near that big, and in Leeds, I think Leeds City Council in particular and partners in the city are doing a great job. We've got 25 people sleeping rough in Leeds on any given night at the moment. That's the latest count. And in West Yorkshire, we've got just over 2,000 people who are homeless each night. So a relatively small number compared to the overall numbers for the country.
25 in Leeds?
25 rough sleepers every night, yeah.
Oh, wow. I actually thought those numbers would be much more, to be honest. So, I'm impressed. How do you think we can tolerate a situation in the UK where there's children who are homeless? How does that situation transpire?
Sure.
And certainly, what are the causes?
Yeah, so there's a lot of misconceptions around the causes of homelessness, and people often relate things like alcohol use, drug use, bad behaviour, criminality, that kind of thing with homelessness. But actually the main cause of homelessness now is the end of an assured short-hold tenancy. In other words, a landlord doesn't let you stay after the end of your tenancy and asks you to leave. That's the main cause of homelessness in the UK now. Second biggest cause is relationship breakdown. So people break up with a partner, and one person has to leave. Maybe they don't have a network of support, end up homeless, and so on. Or they might end up sofa surfing, that kind of thing, sleeping on a friend's floor or sofa for a while, and then that might break down too. So that's the second most common cause. The next one is parental exclusion, so kids literally being kicked out of home.
Right.
or falling out, or running away from home and then not coming back. So that's the third, and the fourth biggest one is mortgage repossession. So people can't pay their bills and lose their home that way.
Right.
And then people who are homeless suffer all sorts of trauma and problems and issues, and often do find that their mental health worsens. Some do get into drugs and alcohol and criminality and so on, and so that's where the connections come from. But they're not the primary causes of homelessness, which is really interesting.
Yeah, I know when I initially spoke to you about doing this interview, I think I said, I guess mental health is one of the causes of homelessness, and actually said it's kind of the chicken or the egg, isn't it, really?
Yeah.
Like, if once you become homeless, your mental health suffers. So,
absolutely.
It's one of those, isn't it? I mean, of course, how wouldn't your mental health suffer if you're cold and you don't have shelter and you're struggling,
Yeah.
So what kind of obstacles do people face in getting out of homelessness? I mean, I know from a bit of the things charitable works that I do, that things like not having a bank account can really impact your ability to find a home. Not having an address in the first place can be very limiting. What are the main obstacles?
Yeah, you're right. Those are definitely big problems for people. I suppose to get to the point where you are homeless, you've hit almost rock bottom, and then things tend to get worse before they get better. So, feeling able in yourself and having enough well-being to take the next step is really difficult, and that's where support comes in as being really important. If you've got people around you, or professional services, charities that can help you, then that's really key. I think people are very vulnerable and often traumatised by whatever's happened to them in the past. So the barriers, partly is the availability of decent accommodation. There's actually a shortage of housing in the UK, or certainly a lack of access to affordable accommodation. We've actually got a lot of housing in the UK, but half of the bedrooms in the country are not used each night, which I find a shocking statistic.
Yeah, wow.
But there are people sleeping rough.
During the COVID crisis, we seem to do quite a good job of homing people, right, who were on the streets, etc.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder why we couldn't continue to do so into
That's
post-COVID.
Right. That is a big question. Of course, there was a big, massive government programme called Everyone In, and across the country, councils were told, get everyone off the streets, however you can, doesn't matter. Beg, borrow and steal, talk to hotels, whatever you need to do, just get everyone in. And 99% people did get off the streets, and that was a fantastic effort by so many people in Leeds and around the country to get all the rough sleepers into accommodation. And it does make you wonder why we can't do that normally, why it takes a massive crisis for us to do it. But there are massive efforts going on around the country, and in Leeds, the fact that we've only got 25 rough sleepers, I mean, that is a tragedy that there's anyone sleeping rough. But compared to other big cities, that's a really low number, and that's good, and it's because of the resources and partnerships that there are in the city.